Forgotten Frontlines. The army that won battles without firing a shot. The Ghost Army of World War II. Picture it. Late summer, 1944. France is still torn open from the fighting that came after D-Day. The ground is uneven, hedgerows hide movement, and roads are crowded with trucks, marching boots, and the ever-present fear of the next ambush. Now imagine you're a German scout, farther back than the front lines, watching the Allies move. Your job is to notice anything that looks like a shift in the enemy's plan. You use binoculars, you look for patterns, you listen. And then, one night, you see it. Sherman tanks, trucks, artillery positions, smoke or dust where you expect military traffic to gather. The sense of organization, whole units appearing like they belong there, like this is the real weight of an invasion force lining up for action. From where you stand, it seems obvious. The Americans are building up at a specific location, probably for an assault that's coming soon. You do what you've been trained to do. You report what you see. You send details back through radio channels. Higher command uses your information to update the defensive map. Plans change, guns reposition, men dig in again, because you've given them something that looks convincing. But here's the twist. None of it is real. Those tanks? Not steel, not crude, not moving because a driver is inside. They were rubber. The soldiers weren't 1,000 men marching into battle. There were barely any at all. The artillery? It wasn't firing. It was recorded, sound blasted through speakers loud enough to reach across the dark countryside. And the most important part? The deception wasn't random. It was built, layer by layer, until the enemy couldn't tell the difference between what you're seeing and what you're supposed to believe. That fake force was the Ghost Army, a secret US Army unit so unusual that its existence was classified for decades after the war. Its members didn't win battles by pushing forward with rifles and tanks. They won by messing with the enemy's mind. By 1944, the Allied forces were advancing across Europe, but advancing didn't mean easy progress. Every mile came with a price. German forces, though withdrawing, were still dangerous. They were trained, dug in, skilled at reading terrain and anticipating where Allied strength might appear. For the Allies, the battlefield wasn't just about courage. It was about math. How many soldiers can you afford to lose? How long can you keep pushing before the next day breaks you? Where can you concentrate power without paying with bodies? You can win a war by brute force, sure, but you can also lose time, lose momentum, and lose people faster than your replacements can arrive. So Allied planners looked for something different, an advantage that didn't require more young men dying in open fields. That advantage wasn't only about weapons, it was about belief. If you can make the enemy think you're stronger in one place than you really are, and weaker somewhere else, they'll rearrange their defenses. And when they rearrange them, you get openings. Sometimes those openings are what decide whether a crossing, an assault, or a breakthrough turns into a disaster or a success. And this is where the Ghost Army fits into the story. Instead of adding more infantry to the front, the army built a unit designed to make infantry seem to be everywhere it wasn't. Officially, the Ghost Army was designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but that name doesn't tell you what they did, because their real weapon wasn't steel or explosives. It was deception, the kind that uses art, technology, and nerve like tools. Their mission was simple to say and hard to imagine. Make the enemy believe an army exists at a certain spot when it doesn't. This meant they weren't a normal combat unit. Recruiters weren't hunting for the biggest, strongest fighters. They were hunting for people with creative skills and technical brains, because what you needed wasn't just toughness, it was imagination applied with discipline. So who ended up in this unit? Many were artists, set designers, radio technicians, sound engineers, people who could draw convincing details, build believable shapes, and understand how sound travels. Some were students from well-known art schools before the war. You can almost see it now. A classroom, sketchbooks, studio lights. not a battlefield. Then, after a recruiter notices your ability to make something look real, suddenly you're training to make the enemy's eyes and ears lie back to them. That's what made the Ghost Army strange. It wasn't a team of hardened soldiers waiting to fight. It was a team of creators waiting to build an alternative reality, just convincingly enough to steer enemy decisions. The Ghost Army didn't rely on one trick. It relied on multiple layers, stacked like a stage performance. Think of it like a magic show. A magician doesn't just do one sleight of hand. They keep your attention moving. They distract you from what actually matters. They give your brain a story it can accept. The Ghost Army did something similar. Their deceptions had at least 4 major layers. 1. Visual deception. Make it look like armored units are there. 2. Sonic deception. Make it sound like armored units are there. 3. Radio deception. Make it sound like the right units are communicating. 4. Human deception. Seed rumors and mislead people who can't be fooled by machines alone. Let's walk through each layer in a way that's easy to picture, even if you've never thought about military deception before. You might expect the deception unit to build cardboard props, but the Ghost Army went bigger than that. They created inflatable decoys, tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces made from rubber-like materials, painted to match real vehicles as closely as possible. From a distance, especially from the air, these inflated shapes could look like real armor. And the incredible part wasn't only that they looked convincing, it was that they were mobile. In a real combat environment, if you set up a fake for too long, the enemy will eventually notice something off. Maybe the movement is wrong. Maybe the angles don't match. Maybe a pilot spots details. So the Ghost Army could inflate an entire decoy display quickly, then deflate it just as fast when it was time to move. They weren't stuck in one place like a traditional army. They were more like a traveling theater troupe. They set the scene, let the audience, the enemy, absorb it, then vanished before the audience could inspect the props too closely. What mattered was the timing, because deception works best when the enemy has to respond quickly. If the enemy is forced to decide under pressure and your illusion is close enough to good enough, they might act on it immediately. That's exactly what the Ghost Army planned to do. Now, imagine you're a German observer at night. You've got darkness, you've got smoke, you've got terrain that blocks your view. Even if you're uncertain, you still need answers. You still need to know whether the Allies are mobilizing near your position. In those conditions, sound becomes information, and the Ghost Army understood this deeply. They used recorded audio from real armored units, capturing the authentic noises that come with movement and combat preparations. Engines, treads grinding over dirt roads, distant movement and clatter. The kind of sounds that suggest artillery is being positioned, voices giving orders. Then, they played those recordings back through powerful speakers mounted on trucks. Under the right conditions, especially at night, those sounds could carry for miles. So while the German scout might see an arrangement of decoys, what they heard could confirm it. The enemy didn't just see the illusion, they experienced it as a living presence. And that's where deception becomes dangerous to the deceived, because once the enemy's senses agree, eyes say armor is here, ears say armor is here, it becomes much harder to doubt. The Ghost Army wasn't just making fake vehicles, it was making fake certainty. Visuals and sounds can still be questioned. Pilots can misjudge distance. Observers can assume they're seeing something temporary. But radio? Radio is harder to ignore. During World War II, radio was essential to command and control. Signal intelligence, listening to enemy transmissions, was a real practice, and Allied forces knew that Germans were listening. So the Ghost Army built another layer into their deception. Radio operators trained to mimic real communication patterns. Not just general radio chatter, but the actual kind of traffic habits that would make it appear that specific American divisions were operating in a certain area. They aimed to replicate communication rhythm, the way units identified themselves through transmissions, and, in effect, the fingerprints of radio behavior. In other words, the deception wasn't limited to what the Germans could see from a distance. It extended into the communication system the Germans were using to track the battlefield. That matters because even if someone suspects visual trickery, they can't easily dismiss a radio signature that matches a known unit's behavior. So the Ghost Army gave the enemy a full system of proof. There's a reason psychological warfare isn't only about machines. People believe what they're told, especially when the story fits what they already fear. Sometimes the Ghost Army used a final approach that relied less on technology and more on timing and nerve. Small teams would enter recently liberated towns, close enough to the front that the information environment was chaotic, while wearing shoulder patches associated with entirely different divisions. They didn't need to march with a huge force. They needed to appear credible in conversation, so they would be seen, they would interact, they would allow rumors to spread, through casual remarks, deliberate confusion, and the kind of talk that spreads in town squares and cafes. In an era before satellite surveillance, before smartphones, before instant verification, rumor could be a powerful intelligence weapon, and the Ghost Army understood that the enemy wasn't the only one gathering information. The enemy's spies and sympathizers would collect hints. Commanders would interpret those hints as likely truth. And the more the story fit the fear and expectation of the moment, the more likely it was to be acted on. In this layer, the Ghost Army wasn't building a fake army on a map. They were shaping what people assumed to be happening off stage. None of this was casual. Every part of the Ghost Army's deception required planning and discipline. A fake setup that looks convincing for 10 minutes might collapse when questioned for an hour. And the Ghost Army couldn't simply wait safely in the rear. For the deception to work, decoys often needed to be placed close to where the enemy would respond, sometimes near enough that German artillery could reach the area. There were risks. There were times when being seen too clearly could expose the trick. There were times when a miscalculation could shift the illusion from convincing to caught. Still, compared to standard combat divisions, the Ghost Army suffered remarkably few casualties. That doesn't erase the danger, but it shows something important. Their work, while risky, was managed with care. The Ghost Army staged over 20 separate deception operations across the European theater during the year after the Normandy breakout. Each one wasn't just set up a fake army and hope. It was meticulous, planned to match the enemy's likely decision-making. Because deception only changes outcomes if it targets the decision points where the enemy has to respond. So the Ghost Army built operations to draw German attention away from where the real attack would occur, make German commanders shift troops into the wrong positions, keep German resources tied down in defensive arrangements that wouldn't matter as much where it counted, and reduce the chances that Allied forces would collide with full strength in the moment of action. Sometimes, deception is about tricking the enemy into a mistake. Other times, it's about preventing the enemy from making the correct move. The Ghost Army did both. Their first true test came not long after Normandy. By then, the Allies were moving, and German defensive patterns were shifting under pressure. That's exactly when deception can be most powerful, because when everything changes quickly, the enemy looks for confirmation. And the Ghost Army needed the enemy to confirm the wrong story. The early operations established credibility, meaning German intelligence and commanders had to begin considering that these illusions might be connected to real preparations. That's one of the subtle effects of deception. Once you've trained an enemy to take your false signal seriously, your real moves become easier. Even if the enemy eventually notices parts of the trick, the time it takes them to adjust can still create openings. In the final months of the war, Allied forces prepared for a high-stakes operation, crossing the Rhine River. Crossing a heavily defended river is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in modern warfare. The river itself is a barrier. The enemy has strong positions. Bridges are vulnerable. Boats can be targeted. And if troops run into concentrated defenses, the cost can be severe, fast. Allied commanders knew that in a crossing like this, even small advantages could mean the difference between success and disaster. So the Ghost Army was given a specific assignment: convince German forces that the crossing would happen at one location while it was actually prepared somewhere else. This wasn't a vague deception. It was a precise one. The plan depended on shifting German defensive resources so that the real crossing point would face a weaker defense, even if only by a meaningful margin. And the Ghost Army had to build that shift day after day with a convincing illusion. For days, they carried out layers of deception aimed at a target location. They inflated decoys, vehicles staged to look like a buildup. They used sonic deception to make the assembling army seem active. Engines, movement, the sounds that suggest logistics and preparation.
They also impersonated radio traffic, and not in a sloppy, obvious way. The goal was to make it appear that real US divisions were operating where the Germans thought the crossing would occur. In the darkness and uncertainty of late war Europe, all of those cues together create a kind of trap for the enemy's decision-making.
German commanders can't simply wait and see what happens when a river crossing might be imminent. They must defend. They must allocate men to likely approaches. So the Ghost Army pushed the enemy toward one conclusion: the crossing is going to happen here. And because that conclusion felt supported by multiple sources, visual cues, sound cues, and radio cues, German defenses moved accordingly. When the real crossing began, Allied forces faced defenses that had been weakened at the intended point of attack. Historians who have studied the operation believe that deception may have saved hundreds, possibly thousands of American lives during one of the war's most dangerous moments.
That's a huge claim, but it's also a logical one. If you think about how defensive resources work, if you've got limited manpower and limited time, you don't split the difference comfortably. You place your best defenses where you believe the attack will happen. If the Ghost Army successfully reroutes that belief, the enemy spends strength defending the wrong place. And the real assault, crossing water under fire, depends on defenders being where they shouldn't be. So the Ghost Army's illusion didn't just confuse the enemy, it changed the battlefield math. If the Ghost Army helped save lives, you might assume they were celebrated. You might imagine reunions, memorials, stories told at parades. But that's not what happened. The Ghost Army was so secret that even after the war ended, its existence remained classified for over 40 years. That means many of the men returned home and were ordered not to discuss what they had done. Think about what that means emotionally. You spent years doing work that requires nerves, creativity, and discipline. You risk danger to support the survival of your comrades. Then you go home, and your contribution can't be explained. You can't tell your family. You can't tell your friends. You can't even fully tell yourself out loud, because the truth is locked behind official silence. That's not just a military secret. It's a kind of missing chapter in personal history, and it lasted a long time. Despite the secrecy, the Ghost Army members carried their talents into civilian life. Many of them became notable after the war, especially in fields that depended on perception, design, and visual storytelling. Some became major figures in American fashion design. Others became celebrated fine artists. For them, the wartime sketches and records of what they built and did didn't disappear forever, but they stayed out of public view until much later, eventually surfacing decades after the war. You can almost connect the dots. If you trained artists to build convincing stage environments for deception, then you're also selecting for people who understand how to control what the eye believes. That skill, manipulating perception ethically or artistically, doesn't vanish after the war. It moves into new careers. So in a way, the Ghost Army didn't only create deception on the battlefield, it also shaped post-war American creative culture. And it's one of the reasons the Ghost Army story is so striking. It's history where art isn't decorative, art is functional, art is strategic. For a long time, the Ghost Army remained a rumor wrapped in government silence. But in the mid-1990s, parts of the operation were declassified and made available to historians and the public. At that point, the world could finally ask questions that had been suppressed for decades. What exactly did they do? How often did they do it? Were the results as significant as they seemed? Who were the men behind the masks of illusion? By then, many veterans were aging or had passed away, so recognition came late, which is another way the Ghost Army story hurts and inspires at the same time. It shows how easily history can hide the people who made it possible, but it also shows that truth can still surface, even after years of silence. In 2022, the Ghost Army was formally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. That's one of the highest civilian honors the US government can bestow. It's not common for a unit known primarily for deception, rather than obvious battlefield combat, to receive such recognition. But it makes sense when you remember what they accomplished. They saved lives, they shaped battles, without firing offensive combat weapons. They helped allies advance with fewer losses, and they demonstrated a kind of warfare where imagination, discipline, and psychological engineering made a measurable difference. Sometimes, history rewards the loudest victories. The Ghost Army reminds you that quiet victories can matter just as much. Here's the reason this story can feel almost unbelievable at first. We're used to war narratives that focus on weapons. Tanks, guns, airplanes, explosions. Even when stories include strategy, they often focus on troop movements, supply lines, and brute force. The Ghost Army adds a new element: psychology as a battlefield. It asks you to consider something uncomfortable but true, that the enemy is made of humans. Humans see, humans listen, humans make decisions, humans interpret clues under pressure. If you can influence that interpretation, if you can shape what the enemy believes is happening, you can influence where the enemy places their strength, and that can be just as decisive as any piece of equipment. The Ghost Army wasn't replacing weapons with art. They were using art to control the conditions under which weapons would matter. It's tempting to think of deception units as gimmicks. Fake tanks, someone might say? Fake sound? Radio impersonation? It sounds like a movie plot, until you remember the real purpose. The enemy's defensive choices weren't based on a story they wanted to believe. They were based on fear and urgency. When a commander believes an attack is coming, they must respond. And the Ghost Army designed its deception to fit the enemy's expectations of reality. That's not childish trickery. It's a serious understanding of how intelligence works. Deception becomes powerful when it's not just convincing for the moment. Deception becomes powerful when it's not just convincing for the moment. If you want to summarize the Ghost Army in plain terms, you can picture it like this. Step 1. Make it look real. Inflatable decoys, painted and positioned so from a distance they resemble armored vehicles and artillery. Step 2. Make it sound real. Recorded sounds from actual armored movements played through loudspeakers, carrying across the night. Step 3. Make it communicate real. Radio operators mimicked patterns and behaviors of real divisions, so signal intelligence matched the illusion. Step 4. Make it feel real to people. Teams used uniforms and patches, appeared in towns, and helped shape rumors and assumptions about troop movement. 4 layers, 1 goal. Steer the enemy's belief so their defenses moved away from where the real action would occur. 4 layers, 1 goal. Steer the enemy's belief so their defenses moved away from where the real action would occur. That's the structure. The success came from how carefully those layers were timed, planned, and executed. It's important not to romanticize war. Deception isn't harmless. It's part of a system where people are at risk. But the Ghost Army story also shows something else. When deception works, it can prevent real violence. If a defensive line is pulled away from the wrong area, the troops who cross or assault face less concentrated resistance. That can reduce casualties. So the Ghost Army's no shots fired isn't a sign that nothing mattered. It's a sign that the unit's job was to make sure the enemy's response would cost them less, and cost the allies less too. Sometimes, the best way to protect people in war is to make the battle happen differently than the enemy expects. When you hear forgotten frontlines, this story fits perfectly, because it's been hidden not by obscurity alone, but by deliberate secrecy. It wasn't just that people didn't know, it's that knowing was prevented. And now, in an era where the public can access history more easily, the Ghost Army feels like a missing puzzle piece. It expands what combat can mean. It adds art and sound engineering to the list of tools that shape history. It shows that strategy can be built out of creativity as much as out of force. In a world that often treats war as purely mechanical, machines against machines, the Ghost Army is a reminder that war is also human perception. Eyes, ears, radios, rumors. Belief itself becomes terrain. So when you think about the Ghost Army, don't picture a battlefield full of dramatic gunfire. Picture something stranger. A team inflating decoys under the pressure of a clock. A truck rolling through darkness with speakers ready to carry recorded engines into the night. Operators carefully matching radio patterns so the enemy hears what they expect to hear. And small groups moving through towns, letting rumors take shape the way smoke takes shape, unseen until it spreads. It's deception built from materials that don't sound like weapons at all. Rubber doesn't explode. A speaker doesn't shoot. A patch on a shoulder doesn't break a wall. But together, under the right conditions, they can redirect armies. Victory didn't come from firing. It came from convincing.
The Ghost Army challenges the idea that winning always looks loud. Sometimes it looks like an illusion that holds just long enough for another plan to succeed. It looks like paint that's accurate from the sky. It looks like sound engineering that makes an invisible force feel present. And it looks like radio discipline that makes the enemy's intelligence system behave like it's tracking a real division. And it looks like people, artists and technicians and builders, using their skills for something far larger than themselves. If you want to see more stories like this, history that's less familiar but every bit as real, make sure to follow along. And remember, in war, sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the one that causes damage. It's the one that makes the enemy move in the wrong direction.